The radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show, where we don't do BS. We call it like it is. All right, lots to talk about today. A lot going on in the world that is insane. We'll cover all of that. I'll answer your questions, of course, so be ready with those. And let's see, we've got already a question from Remo, and thank you, John, for the sticker. So we're off to a blazing start with a question and a sticker. So please consider that. We'll cover the news, we'll answer questions, and then we will talk about bailouts. Bailouts. What's the deal with bailouts? I thought we did away with bailouts, like with Dodd-Frank and stuff. Didn't the regulators promise us never again? So we will talk about that. All right. Let's start just with, you remember we talked about yesterday about Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, dying in the helicopter crash and the consequence for Iran. You know, and I called the guy a lot of names and said that he was a real evil guy and all of that. And the BBC really wants to correct me. I mean, they're really upset, you know, because after all, well, anyway, this is the headline. This is the headline of the story. Raisi's death leaves Iranians with mixed feelings. And you know, he was loved by hardliners, and he was very loyal, and you know, the story had, you know, mixed legacy for Iran. He left a mixed legacy for Iran. Yeah, a mixed legacy of murder, a mixed legacy of oppression, a mixed legacy of versus what? Versus he's stuck by the Islamic rules. He is a real Islamist. He's good for that. It's just unbelievable that nobody's willing to make you know, the moral argument, and nobody willing to call who he is and what he is. You know, the United States actually sent a letter of condolences to Iran. As I mentioned the other day, the United Nations had a moment of silence in the Security Council. I think the representative of the United States stood in silence for a minute for the death of this monster, right? But look, not all was bad. Not all was bad. He did reduce inflation. He did fight corruption. He did build millions of affordable houses. You know, and the fact that the situation in the Iranian economy, the situation in the Iranian economy has gotten worse and worse and worse, put aside everything else, under his leadership, that doesn't matter. I mean, he did prosecute some corrupt people and caught them for bribery and prosecuted them for that. And yes, there are harsher restrictions of free speech. I don't know how to measure that. How do we weigh that exactly? And thousands of people were killed, you know, murdered. How do we weigh that? And he really imposed a much stricter dress code on women. But, you know, he built affordable housing. Hi. I mean, what do you do with Western media these days? The wimpiness, the cowardice is truly unbelievable, and I don't know. I don't know how you survive, how we survive in a world which can't call a monster, but has to play these games of, well, we need to be balanced, and not everything, nothing in the world is black and white, and let's just exaggerate, and you know, yeah, I mean, when under Raisi, when they when they discovered somebody was gay, they only threw him down 5 stories of a building instead of 10 or something like that. I made that up. It's not good to be gay in Iran, but I don't know if they're still throwing people over buildings. That's more Gaza, Palestinian Authority kind of stuff, and ISIS. Not sure if that's Iran. All right, another story to kind of make your day and get you excited about. This is the headline. I mean, this is the headline. It's the headline on the only source of news that matters these days. This is the headline on Twitter, on X, Twitter. Tucker Carlson's new show on Russian TV. Tics and controversy. Tucker Carlson, former news anchor, has launched a new show titled Tucker on Russia 24, a state-owned Russian television network. Now, before you get all excited, this story is false. I just want you to know. You have to wait a few minutes before you read a headline like that to see how people are going to respond and what's going to happen. It's based on a Newsweek story that was then rewritten to adjust. It turns out that Tucker did not launch his own show on Russian television, in spite of what everybody is saying. It turns out that the Tucker Carlson show is being carried on Russian state TV and dubbed and subtitled on Russian state TV. Not that he has an original show for Russian state TV. The difference is minor, I guess, to some extent. One, he is doing the show for them. The other is he's letting them use his content. So I think they're both basically him sanctioning Russian state TV, but one is much more significant. I don't know. I mean, people on Twitter are calling Tucker Carlson a mouthpiece for the Russian regime. That's a shock, right? But really, to discover that, I don't think you had to wait to hear about Tucker's show on Russian TV. All you had to do is watch Tucker a little bit, and you would find out that he is a mouthpiece for the Russian and pretty much every nasty regime out there. But God, everybody bought into this article. I mean, there's so many people commenting on Tucker's new show on Russian TV, when it turns out that Russian TV is basically either stealing or has cut a deal to use what Tucker is doing for Twitter on their platforms. So it'll be interesting. You remember when I used Tucker on this platform, on our platform, on YouTube here, it froze. You remember we got that warning? I got that warning about copyright violations because I was using a Tucker Carlson. I guess Russian TV has no worries about that, and since it's not using YouTube, it's not going to be stopped in any kind of way. Newsweek's original story said Tucker Carlson launches show on Russian TV. Its revised story says, I had it here a second ago, the revised story was a little different. It basically says something about Russian TV is Tucker's content, so not quite the same thing. But everybody basically picked it up. It's everywhere. Tucker's show is on Russian TV, which is different than Tucker's show. Tucker has a show on Russian TV, for what it's worth. All right, I don't have much to say about that other than, you know my views on Tucker Carlson, and it wouldn't surprise me if Tucker moved to Russia and started a TV show. Actually, he would. Tucker's a real snob and a real... he likes his American lifestyle. We saw how often he goes to the grocery store by his little tour in the Russian grocery store and what he was enamored by. He obviously has people go to the grocery store for him. I don't think he wants to give that up. I don't think he wants to lower his standard of living. I think Tucker's like a New England snob or whatever snob. He's just horrible. Anyway, talking about Russia. Yeah. The EU has just announced that it has reached an agreement to basically take the profits on frozen Russian assets and give them to Ukraine. I mean, this is great, a great act of justice. Although what they should do is just give those assets to Ukraine. But you know, and I don't know if this includes frozen assets of Russian oligarchs, or this is just Russian government frozen assets. But basically, European Union as well as the United States have basically frozen the assets, but the assets are still sitting in investments. Those investments are still yielding returns. Those returns are typically just reinvested in the assets, so they stay there. Imagine a saving account that has $1 billion of Russian money. It's earning, I don't know, 4% interest. That's 4% interest is $40 million a year. That $40 million just sits there in an account, and it will get interest. It will compound. What the Europeans are suggesting is that they will take that $40 million and they will give it to Ukraine as a gift. And God, that's a great way to fund. That's a great way to fund Ukraine. It's not private property. This is Russian government money, and even if it is a private property, these are oligarchs. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous, right? We haven't cut off diplomatic relationships with Russia, but we've basically sanctioned individuals in Russia in kind of perverse ways. We've locked up their money. I mean, their money might be locked up for decades. Who knows when they'll ever get the money back? It's just a weird, again, kind of unprincipled, bizarre kind of foreign policy. Just if Russia is the enemy, then cut off diplomatic relations, bring everybody home, and you know, shut it down. Why are you pretending and playing nice with the Russians while I don't know, you're sanctioning individuals and you're freezing government money? Go all in or stay out of it. The whole thing is absurd. Is absurd. But yeah, I think if it's government money, good for the European Union. It's a good use of the money to give it to Ukraine. You know, and if Russia wins, then they can collect it at the bank in Kiev. If Russia loses, then they lost, and who cares, right? So good solution, and so that is happening. It's you know, somewhat surprising on this issue how much courage, assertiveness the Europeans have. They don't seem to have it on really any other issue, on any other topic in the world that relates to anything. But on Russia, they really do seem to be assertive. I'll give them that. Good for them. It's better that we have some assertiveness than none at all. All right, so I guess Zelensky was in, I don't know where he was, but maybe with the German foreign minister, and finalized this deal where he's going to get a bunch of money from the interest that these frozen assets are collecting. Mary Aline, thank you for the sticker. Gail, thank you. Appreciate it. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, we talked about the other day, we talked about the fact that the United States added these crazy tariffs on Chinese goods, 100% on EVs, and taxing basic materials, and taxing what do you call it? Batteries, and the whole gamut of what they call green technologies that basically the Western world basically depends on China for. We won't mine in the United States for the materials. We have to import them from China, but we put tariffs on them. And of course, what happens there is China could very well just turn off the spigot at some point. It could say, you know what, we're just not going to sell you all those materials that you need in order to make those batteries in your factories. We just don't give you the materials. And, you know, that would create real problems for the West. China doesn't want to do that right now. It doesn't want a full blown out trade war because it needs the money. It needs the foreign exchange it generates from selling this stuff. But that is an option as we become more dependent on the raw materials, which they have, which we refuse to mine over here. It's a problem. It turns out that, like lithium, which is one of the raw materials that is essential, is now found in the waste generated by fracking, at least in Pennsylvania. They've discovered lithium. So to frack, they use water and sand at very, very high pressure, and it pushes the natural gas or the oil out of the rock. But it turns out that with it, lithium is coming out. And that might be a new source of lithium that doesn't require, I guess, mining, and maybe the EPA in the United States will let somebody mine that, or I don't know what you would call it. I don't know if it's mining, but extract that and use it to sell into world markets. I mean, yeah, so anyway, we've got these high tariffs, which are crazy and silly and don't really, don't make any sense and are destructive to the U.S. economy, and basically are declaration that we have lost. By the way, for many of these materials, China basically has 80% of the market share, and there's just very few sources for these anywhere, at least known sources. Again, there's lots of places we can dig in the world to find them. Mongolia, for example, has a lot of these natural resources. But again, so does Wyoming and Montana, and it's just a question of digging and excavating them. Anyway, we are now exporting this stupid policy to the rest of the world. One of Biden's key kind of initiatives is to get other countries to impose tariffs on China, so that they cripple their own economies as well, so that the United States is not alone in this. But the idea is to build a whole coalition, between in the West that basically cuts China off. And you think this will bring world peace? That's really worked in the past. Cutting countries off has really encouraged them to be peaceful in significant ways. God, people don't study history. They really do not study history. All right, so anyway, Yellen is in the EU and is encouraging them to raise tariffs or to put other import restrictions on green tech coming from China and other places, so that Europe can compete with the United States, I guess, instead of the United States competing with itself, so that we can all sink into mediocrity and oblivion and pretense that we are strong. We know what we're doing. We are courageous. Now, so if you didn't know, Yellen is in Europe. We'll get to Yellen, Yellen's European trip in a minute again, in a few seconds. All right, let's go. Yeah, let's go to Yellen. Doing some good work. I have something positive to say about Janet Yellen. I mean, this is amazing. This is truly amazing. So it turns out that Yellen was at the conference. I guess the G20. This is the group of 20 major economies in the world, and Brazil is part of this. And Brazil, joined by a number of other countries, Brazil is proposing a global billionaire tax, Brazil, like many other countries around the world, France, for example, Spain, Germany, South Africa, are very upset that their billionaires are moving to jurisdictions that tax them less. They're moving to, I don't know, Monaco, or they're moving to, I don't know how many billionaires live in Puerto Rico, but some may be moving here. Brazil, they're probably moving to Uruguay. Uruguay has pretty low taxes. And Hong Kong and maybe Singapore and maybe some other places. So billionaires are leaving high tax jurisdiction to low tax jurisdiction. Who knew? Who knew that would happen when you raise your taxes? So the idea is, if we have a global tax, if every country in the world signs up to have a global tax of on billionaires, then they would stay in their countries, and then the countries would benefit from this tax, and they would also benefit from the camaraderie that is attained by having the billionaires among us. I mean, I would think that given how evil the billionaires are, we would want them to send them away. There is already a global tax on corporations. There's a minimal global tax on corporations. That is, 120-something countries have signed a treaty to basically have a minimum tax, I think it's 20%, on corporations. The United States signed this, but Congress has not approved it, and Congress is unlikely to approve it. But it would be, it is a minimum corporate tax. Oh no, it's not 20%, it's 15%. It's 15%. They must pay in the jurisdiction where they operate. But, you know, Republicans oppose this, so it's not going to pass. You need 60 votes in the Senate to get this passed. But United States, the Biden administration did approve it. Anyway, Brazil suggested the billionaire tax. I'm not sure at what level they proposed it, but they just want a uniform, global, so billionaires can't hide, can't run away, right? Can't run away. And basically it would be a minimal tax, like the corporate tax. You would be free in your jurisdiction to have it higher. But if they left, they would still pay something. There would be some minimal that everybody agreed that they have to pay. To Janet Yellen's credit, to the Biden administration's credit, she said it was a non-starter. Donors to Biden would object. No, she didn't say that latter part. I swear she didn't say that latter part. She was just thinking it in her head. But basically, the Biden administration has vetoed this idea of a billionaire's global tax. But this is the kind of thinking going on. I mean, Thomas Piketty, in his famous book, published, 10 years ago? No, 12, 13 years ago, suggested a global tax, a global wealth tax, even worse than a billionaire tax, a global wealth tax, in order to prevent people from moving to low tax jurisdictions, and more importantly, in order to penalize the wealthy so as to reduce inequality. Piketty was honest enough, he's not usually honest, but in this he was honest enough, to admit that such a tax would not really have an impact on the poor. That is, it wasn't enough to redistribute that money to the poor to make a dent with the poverty. But he did say it would penalize the rich and lower inequality, which he viewed as a value in and of itself. This is a variation on that, and a global tax. This is what some countries in Europe would like to have. This is what some countries in Latin America, I guess, would have. South Africa, but at least in the United States, even the Biden administration, hard to believe, is resisting this one and saying no. And again, you could imagine the response of the billionaires who do donate to Biden. I mean, no political campaign. The American political system couldn't really survive in its current form without the massive amounts of money that billionaires contribute to the various campaigns. So if there are billionaires listening to this show, and there might be a handful, they might be. Although if they are, then if you are a billionaire, then I can guarantee that you're not contributing enough monthly to the show. You should at the very least be at the $500 a month category. So please consider, if you're a billionaire or a centimillionaire or a whatever millionaire, please consider becoming a monthly supporter of the show at the $250, $500 a month level. It really will not dent millionaire or billionaire status and will enhance our ability to do the show. Anyway, yes, billionaires, you can sigh of relief, which is good because, as you know, I'm a huge fan of billionaires. I'm a huge supporter of billionaires. The status of a billionaire, particularly even in a semi-free market, suggests to me real productive genius, suggests to me real value creation, and a lot of win-win and a lot of me winning. So thank you to all the billionaires listening to the show. But yeah, I do want to remind you about that monthly contribution. All right, monthly billionaire tax. I mean, global billionaire tax. Can you imagine? Portland, Oregon. Do you guys remember Portland, Oregon during 2020? BLM, really into 2021? I mean, Portland, Oregon was the worst of the worst in terms of a complete breakdown of law and order, rioting, violent rioting every night, trying to basically break into and attack federal buildings, police, to a large extent, Oregon police standing to the side. And what was the response of the Oregon City Council at the time? I mean, basically the response was defund the police. We don't need as much police. I mean, all this violence you're seeing in our streets are basically a consequence of police. I did a show at the time about how this derives from, I think, from Rousseau's attitude that basically violence is oppressed people's response to civilization. That is, in our non-civilized state, in our state of nature, we are not violent creatures. It is civilization, in other words, things like police, that bring out the violence in us. And if we want to be in peace, we have to destroy civilization, right? So anyway, Portland, as you remember, Portland defunded the police. The response to defunding the police in Portland was, as you'd expect, that crime rates increased. Portland is one of the worst crime cities in the country. Certainly was one of the worst places was the worst place in the country during the 2020 riots. In the years since 2020, homicide rates tripled, car thefts soared. Much of downtown basically was overtaken by open drug use. The violent crime overall, remained, even though murder rates came down last year in 2023. Overall violent crime remains 17% above 2019 levels. So the consequence of defunding the police and not letting the police do their job in 2020 resulted in all of this. On Tuesday, I guess today, Portland voters vote on for a new, a district attorney. I think it's a district attorney. That's what they called. Yeah, district attorney. In 2020, Schmidt, who is something Schmidt. What's his first name? I forget his first name. Anyway, Schmidt was elected, massive progressive. He's the guy who defunded the police, didn't bring violent criminals and expect jail terms for them. In 2020, he won with a 77% landslide. 77% landslide. Anyway, right now, as we speak, Portland citizens are voting. And Schmidt, representing the progressives and representing the Democratic Party, is running against not a Republican, a independent, an independent by the name of Vasquez. Again, I'm missing the first name. Yeah, Nathan Vasquez. Nathan Vasquez. Nathan Vasquez is running on a simple message, of law and order. He is going to prosecute criminals. He's going to encourage the city council to increase the money for policing. He is going to clamp down on crime. According to the polls, and of course tomorrow hopefully we'll know the result of the election, Vasquez was leading Schmidt by 19 percentage points. 19 percentage points. Now, we'll see if that actually happens. If one of the candidates wins 50%, because this is like an open primary, if one of the candidates wins over 50%, they're in. If they get under 50%, I guess the top two run in another election. The expectation is that Vasquez will get over 50%. He will be the next district attorney. So even in woke, crazy, nutty, violent Portland, where if you ever watch Portlandia, the radical, crazy left, woke, touchy-feely, fill in all the different blanks, even in Portland, there is only so much they're willing to tolerate. Even in Portland, it appears that they're going to elect somebody who stands for law and order and intends to clamp down on crime. So let's hope that he actually wins. Portland, if you've ever been, I don't know if any of you have ever been, Portland has to be one of the most beautiful cities in the United States. It's gorgeous, it's green, it has these amazing trees. You can go on pretty short drives to see some magnificent waterfalls and amazing forests. Not far from that, there is Willamette Valley, I think, where you can get some unbelievable wine. So Portland, Oregon is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place. So I encourage you to visit. Eugene is not as nice. I do think Portland is nicer. It's right on the Columbia River, and it's what, 2-hour drive to Seattle. It's a really beautiful part of the world. So I encourage you guys to visit. Seattle is beautiful. That whole area is beautiful. And once it becomes safer, and once they have a better district attorney, it'll even be nicer to visit. All right. So, yeah. Why is this here and that is there? All right, something's confusing here. This one I can close. Okay. So yes, this is one more piece in my ongoing claim that when anything woke kind of actually becomes reality, and American people are confronted with the reality, the outcome. The American people are not very intellectual. They can't project. They can't see it coming. They don't understand that it's evil as an idea. They're willing to try anything. But once it becomes clear that whatever the idea was, it results in people dying in the streets, the American people usually change their mind and reject it. And we see that whether it's in education, the extreme, the really wacky stuff gets crushed at the end. It takes a while, and kids are damaged. So this is not a good solution. And when you get defund the police, it's reversed. It's reversed in Minneapolis, reversed now in Portland. It was reversed in San Francisco. In LA, it was reversed dramatically. And they ultimately they come around to better policies, but not intellectually, because Americans are very non-intellectual and always have been. Ayn Rand recognized this back in the 60s, that you know, how non-intellectual or even anti-intellectual Americans tended to be. And, you know, being intellectual doesn't mean it's good, but being intellectual means that when something goes wrong, you might think and learn the lessons from it and might try to correct it. And when things go well, you might try to emulate that because you try to generalize from your experiences rather than just dealing with experiences one at a time. And I think generally Americans not very intellectual. All right. Let's see. This one is kind of a funny one. So there's a new paper out examining kind of financial gurus. Should you listen to financial gurus? How good are they? Do they make you money if you listen to them? And the paper, it's a new paper by, doesn't matter, I can't pronounce the author's name. It's called Finfluencers, F-I-N-Fluences. So no, actually influences, but with a capital F in front of it. Finfluences, so financial influences. Basically it aggregates the paper. What the paper does is aggregates a bunch of tweets from stock twits, where you can find advice from influencers about stocks to buy or sell, financial advice generally. So what the paper first does is it assesses the investment advice provided by different finfluencers, right? It does so by categorizing these influencers into a number of different categories based on their biography, based on who they are, what they are, and where they come from. So of the people on stock twits that are giving advice, they evaluated that about 28% of the finfluencers are, let me backtrack. So they divided the group into three: skilled, unskilled, and anti-skilled. I love the anti-skilled. So skilled is, they know what they're doing. They've got some skill here. Unskilled is they have no clue what they're doing. And anti-skilled is what they know is so wrong that it really does hurt them. It really is bad. And so what they find is 28% of influencers provide valuable investment advice that leads to monthly abnormal returns of 2.6%. So this is kind of above market risk adjusted. So 28% of the influencers do pretty well. Now, we don't know if that's because they're really skilled or whether they're lucky, but it doesn't matter. For the purpose of this, 28% outperform. 16% are unskilled, right? Basically, unskilled, they basically give you the same thing as the market does. They're basically not doing any harm. They're basically not doing any damage. But it turns out that the majority of influencers on stock twits, 56%, are anti-skilled. They're anti-skilled in the sense that following their investment advice yields monthly abnormal returns of negative 2.3%. Now that's a lot. Monthly negative 2.3%. Extrapolate to a year. So that's kind of interesting. Not surprising at all. But here's the question. Who do you think have the most followers? The people who have historically provided above market returns? The people who just match the market? Or the 56% who are what you'd call anti-skilled? Well, I don't think you're going to be surprised that the anti-skilled have the most followers, have the most activity, and actually influence trading more than anybody else. That is, the one that caused their followers to lose money are the ones followed the most. Now, I think that explains why, I have as many subscribers and followers on Twitter as I do. I think it's exactly this. Because ultimately, I'm one of the skilled influencers, and therefore I'm less followed than called it anti-skilled influencers, of which there are many out there that actually do damage to their listeners and viewers and people who follow their advice. I actually provide good advice, and therefore I have few followers. This is a great, great study that reaffirms my personal bias about my own abilities and everything else. That's right. Alex Jones has many millions of followers because he is life-destroying in his advice. I am life-enhancing and therefore have only tens of thousands. So the more you give bad advice, the more attention you get. And it's not just that the more followed. The more retweeted, the more thumbs up, the more everything else, right? It's pretty scary. All I would say to you guys is be careful of the financial advice that you're getting. Be skeptical of any financial advice you get on Twitter. Past performance is no guarantee of future performance. I'd be really interesting to follow the skilled influencers to find out how they do over time. I need to see if there are any papers who do that. That would be interesting. But I mean, I thought this was kind of fun and interesting. But yes, beware of trading on advice you get on Twitter or advice you get really anywhere. Beware of day trading. Beware of investment advisors who are not recommending that you diversify and forget about it. Diversify and forget about it. That's the way to invest for most of us. I will add this. You remember the meme stock? You remember last week there was a meme stock craze, and GameStop went through the roof. It went up 100%. Well, it dropped 100%, basically. It dropped almost, it gave back almost everything that it gained within the next few days after that. People lost something like $3.2 billion. The people who got caught by buying at the top lost a fortune. You know, the market produces a new sucker every second, and the suckers don't know it, and the suckers don't realize it, and the suckers just multiply. They recreate themselves. They try it again. It's like a roulette wheel. They'll go after it again and again and again and again. It's like gambling. And it is truly, truly scary. I do have some finance lectures on at ARI. If you look for the ARI store, I have some investment lectures. They're from 1998, so a lot has happened since 1998. There are a few things I would probably revise in those lectures if I was going to do them again. But they are there in 1998 anyway. Oh, which reminds me, thank you for reminding me this. I am, as you know, I'm doing this finance course for the Peterson Academy, and it turned out the link I gave you guys is wrong, doesn't work anymore because they've changed in preparation for launching the website. They've changed the website, and that particular those kind of links don't work anymore. So I'm expecting a new link any minute now, any hour now, any day now. Also, we've made a change to the schedule. I guess when they scheduled me for next week, they forgot that Monday was Memorial Day, so I was supposed to be there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So we're not going to do Monday. Instead, we're just going to do Tuesday, Wednesday, which means a much more intense schedule for me and for anybody who comes to watch, but maybe easier for you from a workload perspective because it will be Tuesday, Wednesday. Maybe we can get some students to come, if you know any students who'd like to come, because school is off, it's summer now. But Tuesday, Wednesday, 4 hours each, you can sign up. I will stay tuned. I will put it up on Twitter as soon as I get the link, and I will mention it here as well. But it would be great to get a good-sized audience for the finance course next week. I think it's going to be a fun course, and still working on it. The capitalism course I thought went really, really well, and we'll see what the people in post-production at Peterson Academy think, but the people there, I think, really enjoyed it. All right, quickly. So South Korea is running out of babies. It's not having kids. Lowest birth rates in the world, 0.7 birth rates per, I guess, female, which is the lowest ratio in the world. I think it's 0.78. No, wait a second. It's 0.78, projected to be 0.65 in 2025, and in Seoul, in the capital, it's already at 0.59. So South Koreans are not having kids. It's really amazing. They're also the hardest working people in the world. They work more hours than anywhere. They're fairly wealthy. You go to Seoul and they seem to have a high standard of living, relatively high standard of living, a relatively high quality of life, but they work long hours. They work a lot, and they don't have kids, and they don't raise kids, and they're not getting married, and I think if they're following global trends, they're not having a lot of sex. Of course, maybe not having a lot of sex explains not having a lot of kids. So in South Korea, they're talking about incentives, trying to incentivize women to have babies. And one of the proposals is to actually give them cash benefits, right? Cash grants in order to have the babies. So they are thinking of, I mean, this is an astounding figure, but they're actually thinking of giving people baby bonuses. You have a baby, you get a check. But not a trivial check. They're actually thinking of the bonus to be 100 million won. 100 million won is $70,000. So every baby you have, you get $70,000. Now that's about twice South Korea's annual per capita income. So, in other words, GDP divided by the population. That's a lot of money. At current birth rates, the plan would cost more than $16 billion a year. But of course, if it's successful, if there are more babies, then it would be a lot more money. Now, I don't know anybody in the world that's giving anything close to this amount of money for babies. I mean, there are all kinds of tax credits, there are all kinds of tax benefits, there may be even some cash benefits in some countries. Hungary has a pretty aggressive program to try to encourage women to have babies. First, in no country that I know of is this having massive success. In Hungary, which is one of the more aggressive places in the world, it's basically stabilized. The number of babies is increasing a little bit, but really a little bit, nothing major. $70,000 is a lot of money. It could actually change. Now, the idea is that this program is, over the long run, self-financing, because here's the logic, very collectivistic logic, right? We pay parents $70,000 today. They have a kid, but that kid is going to pay taxes throughout his life. So if this program actually generates more kids, that means more taxpayers. That means those future taxpayers, those kids, will pay back the $70,000. But you need a lot of kids, additional kids, to pay back the $16 billion a year in taxes in the future. This assumes having a major impact, the kind of impact that actually would move the needle here. It's not clear that the expected value of all those future taxes, because imagine if you give out $70,000 and the birth rate doesn't change, or maybe you just stabilize it. It's not enough kids to pay back for this, right? Because these kids would have been born anyway. These are kids that would have been there anyway. You've just wasted $16 billion. So it is going to be interesting. If they do this, we'll see if they pass this. It'll be a massive experiment in kind of social planning, in incentivizing behavior in people. But notice what you're doing. Notice how collectivistic this is. I said it was collectivistic. I didn't explain why. Because you're basically treating Koreans as a collective. You're taxing adults today and saying, we'll get the money back from taxes on people in the future. But the people, how do the people you're taxing today benefit from that? How do the people taxing today are not going to get their money back? Again, this is just Korean society will benefit. Korean society is taxing and then has a benefit. So, yes, this is a collectivistic, insane scheme. I mean, all of the discussion about birth rates and demographics is sheer collectivism. The whole discussion about birth rates and, I mean, other than just informative, which is interesting in and of itself, but the whole discussion about we need to increase birth rates, we need to do this with birth rates, we need to get people to have more babies, we need to do this or that with people. Pure collectivism and pure central planning in an attempt to manage everything. My guess, and granted, I'm only guessing, that if we actually move towards more freedom, if we actually move towards liberty, if we actually move towards a society that respected the individual and respected his rights and respected his choices in life, and we move towards a society that respected reason, respected both reason in women and reason in men, respected people's career choices, but also the choice to stay home and raise kids, if we actually just move to a rational or semi-rational, it doesn't have to be a objectivist utopia, but something close to that, birth rates would go up. Birth rates are down today because of the confusion. They're down because of the mixed economy. They're down because of the high costs which the mixed economy has produced. They're down because of the cultural confusion about what women should do. They're down because primarily, I've argued, they're down because we live in a pessimistic era. We live in an era where people don't believe in the future. They don't care about the future. They don't think the future's any good. They think we're all going to die because of climate change or World War III or the coming apocalypse or whatever it happens to be. They're convinced that human beings are destroying the planet. Who the hell wants to bring more human beings onto the planet if we're destroying it? So the solution, to the extent that you care in terms of birth rates, is the solution for everything. A culture of reason, a culture of egoism, a culture of liberty and freedom. And the one thing we should reject out of hand, is any attempt by the government to use the tax code or subsidies or whatever to try to manipulate us into having kids. Just like I reject the government using subsidies and tax deductions and stuff to manipulate us into doing anything. Freedom is what you need. Birth rates are down because of pessimism. Countries that don't have problems with feminism have the same declining birth rates. South Korea does not have the United States court system. Japan does not have the United States court system. Japan does not have the same problems with feminism the United States have. You guys are so ignorant of, you guys, I'm talking about a few people on the chat. You guys are so ignorant of what actually is happening in the world, what actually goes on. You cannot explain Japanese birth rates. You cannot explain Chinese birth rates. You cannot explain Chinese birth rates, Japanese birth rates, South Korean birth rates, based on the courts. Because the courts is an American problem. It's not a problem in those other countries. And you can't explain it based on feminism. Feminism is a Northern European, Western European problem. It doesn't even explain low birth rates in Italy. It doesn't explain low birth rates, certainly not in Asia. I mean, ignorance. Ignorance, people. What civil courts are in Japan and South Korea? None. Even in Europe, that's not a problem. It's only in the United States that we have this problem. And feminism doesn't exist in those places. It's really amazing to me how people come up with simplistic solutions that basically amount to kind of in a dead end, blame the left, and then they accuse me of red pilling, right? Because they won't think, right? It's the courts and feminism. And again, I ask very simply, very straightforwardly to anybody who's actually willing to think, feminism in Japan, feminism in China, really? The kind of feminism that you're talking about exists in those places, in China, in Japan, in South Korea? It's just use your mind, think. And feminism is a lot weaker in Italy than it is in Holland. And feminism is pretty strong in Israel. Feminism is very strong in Israel. Women fight in combat. They never used to in my time, but they do today. Combat in Gaza, there are women fighting. And feminism is very strong in Israel. And Israel has, even among the secular Jews in Israel, has a very high birth rate. So you cannot explain phenomena with that explanation when there's so many counterexamples. Literally, counterexamples. Dozens of them. Yes, TikTok is preventing people from having babies. That's the problem. It is, in a sense, that it's producing a culture that's anti the future. Having babies, for those of you, I have a suspicion that some of the people commenting have never had them. Having babies is an act that involves confidence in the future. It's an act that is about optimism about the future. When you're a pessimist, when you don't believe the future has anything to offer, you don't have babies. And TikTok absolutely reinforces, and so does Facebook, and so does Twitter, and so does everywhere else, reinforce a negative view of the world, a pessimistic view of the world, all of that, and that is resulting in, that results in not having kids because people don't believe in the future. And that is a consequence of the mixed economy and corrupt ideas, the mixed economy of ideas. But to blame feminism is just stupid. It's just silly. It's counterfactual. Can't explain Israel. Can't explain China. You cannot explain Japan. And you cannot explain Korea. You cannot explain a lot of these places. You can't even explain Italy, which has one of the lowest birth rates. You won't find a correlation between a measure of feminism and birth rates. If you track them on a graph, you would not find a high level of correlation between the two. Or you would find a lot of outliers if you did. All right, Russia, by the way. Russia has very, very, very low birth rates, much lower than Western Europe. And yet feminism is less of an issue in Russia than I'd say Western Europe. So there's been a switch now from feminism to TikTok, all right? So they'll keep searching for the simple, dumb explanation rather than thinking and trying to work through an actual explanation. All right, let's see. That is our news. Right? We're now going to switch to answering your Super Chat questions. And then I want to talk about bailouts, financial bailouts, bank bailouts, I forgot this story. All right, we can leave that story for another time. I've got the manicure economy. The manicure economy, that's a fascinating story. All right, that again confirms stuff I've said in the past. So I always like stories that confirm stuff I've said in the past. Anyway, A few reminders. If you'd like to attend my public speaking seminar, where I will help you become a better presenter, more confident speaker, and be better at organizing your talks, and be better at just delivery. This is applicable for both corporate kind of PowerPoint presentations, or you just speaking, or giving a toast at a wedding, or whatever issue you have, or whatever opportunities you have to communicate verbally in a public setting. This course is for you. It'll just make you better at whatever it is, however it is you apply this issue to. So that I will be doing that. I'll be doing it the day after OCON ends. So it'll be the 20th, I believe. The 19th. It'll be the 19th of June. 19th of June. It'll be, depending on how many people show up, it'll be half a day to full day. It's a small group of people, maximum 10, and a lot of interaction, a lot of one-on-one time, and you get to present. I get a critique. I get to give you some principles about public speaking, and we talk that through. Let's see, what else? Public speaking seminar. I want to remind you that the Ayn Rand Institute is a sponsor of the Yaron Brook Show. So it is, we have the flash sale, but you still can use you can still apply for OCON and get a 10% discount because you are listening to Yaron Brook Show. All you have to do is use a code 24YBS10. 24YBS10. And you can get a 10% off a discount. OCON, as I've said, is the perfect place to explore new ideas. It's also the perfect place to meet a lot of objectivist experts like Gregory Salomieri, Tara Smith, and many others. And it's also a great place to play poker. One of the highlights of OCON every year, for me at least, is the annual poker tournament. And I know a lot of people enjoy trying to beat me at poker. Most of them are disappointed by the end of the night, but a few get to actually beat me. So please join us playing poker. I am a really, really bad poker player. So the fact that I survive usually until the final table at these poker tournaments is just an indication of how poor all the other poker players are. So if you think you're a good poker player, you could come to OCON and clean up. Now, you don't actually make any money. It all goes to a valuable charitable cause, the Ayn Rand Institute. But you get the bragging rights of being the Objectivist champion poker player. So join us at OCON. So it's great socializing, great education, really intellectually stimulating. And then Alex Epstein is another sponsor of the show, and you can get Alex Epstein's work at alexepstein.substack.com. I encourage everybody to sign up. One of the most valuable, insightful, interesting thinkers, I think, in the world today. He focuses on issues relating to energy, climate change, fossil fuels. He's written a book called Fossil Future, which is brilliant. I encourage you to buy it, purchase it. And then Alex also has Alex AI, which is an AI platform based on Alex's ideas, a chat box that you can ask questions about the topics we just discussed and get answers. That I think will cost you, but you can sign up at the Substack at the address I gave you, alexepstein.substack.com. Get the AI, get the Substack, and join a number of, I think, governors, congressional leaders, and congressional staffers in getting the best talking points about these issues in the world, basically. All right, let's see what we have here in terms of super chat. $20 would get us to where we need to be right now in terms of super chat income. So somebody come in with a $20 question or a $20 sticker just to get us over the target and make me feel like the first hour paid for itself. All right, Remo, can you tell the full story of the Holocaust if you exclude the causes of anti-Semitism. Yesterday, I visited the new Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam, and they did not mention anything about usury, Marx, Luther, etc. Did they mention that Jews were accused of crucifying Christ? That the Catholic Church spread that lie for a long, long time, and indeed, there was a period in which it wasn't Roman soldiers, because you don't want Roman soldiers doing it, because the Roman Empire had adopted Christianity. You had Jews crucifying Christ. No, I mean, they're not going to mention the causes of anti-Semitism, partially because they don't want to admit them, partially because they don't want to offend the people who actually did this, the Christians or whatever. They don't want to actually present you with history. All they want to do is stimulate your oppressed people's instincts, right? I'm all for Holocaust museums, but all they really focuses on is look how awful this is, look how evil this is. But they are always short on explanations. They're always short on real education. They haven't read the ominous parallels. They can't give you an actual explanation for what caused the Holocaust, in why Kant and Hegel are responsible. And they can't explain the role of German intellectuals. And they don't want to go to the origins of anti-Semitism, money lending, but also the Christian origins, the religious origins, or even just the hatred of the other for being the other. I mean, that would have implications for today, and you don't want to do that. So yes. Anyway, it is quite a mess. Notice that it's an exercise in some education about history, but all oriented towards altruism, all oriented towards you feeling sorry for the oppressed. And then realizing as you walk out of the museum, but the Jews got stronger, and now they're rich, and now they have their own country, and that country's really super rich. Oh, I shouldn't feel sorry for them anymore. Yeah. Anyway, God forbid we try to have explanations. God forbid we show the role of ideas and we show the role of particular organizations, entities, ideologies in shaping history. That is, that's the role of the intellectuals. But the intellectuals, of course, are defaulted in that role. And now the answer to any question in history is, it's complicated. It's complicated. It's messy. Don't go there. It's messy. Who wants cause and effect? And of course, if you can't find cause and effect in history, then you're bound to repeat the causes. And surprise, surprise, you're going to get the same effects because it's complicated. Don't be simplistic, Yaron. Don't actually look for reasons for things. That's childish. Stop asking why. That's what people do to their kids. Stop asking why. There are no answers. It's complicated. Life is a mess. Just accept ambiguity. Live in the gray zone. All right, that'll bring out the best in people. Clark, are the real haters out there even curable? No. The real haters, the nihilists, the university professors who taught this generation of kids basically to hate, to focus on hatred, to relish hatred, to be hateful in every respect. I mean, what are you going to do with them? There's no value there. There's no saving them. There's no curing them. I mean, the kids might grow out of it, like the kids who occupied whatever in Colombia. They might look back on this 10 years from now and think, oh God, that was stupid. So they're curable. But the real ideologues, the people at the heart of these demonstrations, the people who lead them, and the professors who create the actual context for them, they are incurable, right? Incurable. Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles had nothing to do with the Second World War and the rise of the Nazis. If you want to understand the rise of the Nazis, there's only one book, and that is Leonard Peikoff's Ominous Parallels, or I think there is a version of it that's just about the Nazis, the rise of, I can't remember what it's called, but just look under Leonard Peikoff, it is the definitive book on the rise of the Nazis. And of course, it has the uniquely objectivist view of history, which is that ideas shape history, not any particular treaty, a particular action, a particular individual, but it is ideas. I mean, what shaped, the whole sequence of events leading up. It was not one specific event. It was fundamental ideas that shaped all the events. Clark, I used to believe repressing your emotions was unhealthy and cowardly. But at the same time, giving into every emotion strikes me as equally unhealthy and cowardly. How does one strike a balance? Well, nobody has ever suggested that you give in to your emotions. Maybe some people do suggest that. Some people on the left and on the right suggest that. They don't suggest that. So, objectivism does suggest you give in to your emotions. Certainly repressing them is self-denial. It's dishonesty. It's damaging. It's self-destruction. So the proper approach to emotions is to recognize them, but not act on them. Embrace them, but not act on them again, not just jump on them. Think about them. I felt threatened there. Or what he said, I felt defensive when he criticized me. Why? Is this an issue of self-esteem? Is this an issue of maybe he had a point and I don't want to admit it to myself? Why did I feel it? Why did I get angry with him? Don't act on it until you've had that conversation with yourself and figure out whether the emotion makes sense or not. So emotion should never be repressed, but neither should be just jumped on and acted on. Okay. All right. James, did Ayn Rand believe altruism could be more swiftly uprooted and reversed than it actually turns out to be? Probably early. I think when she published Atlas Shrugged, she thought that the response would be different. She thought the book would resonate among some intellectuals. She thought some intellectuals, the better intellectuals, would rally to her side and help overcome altruism. But once that didn't happen, I don't think she ever had the delusion of how hard it would be to overcome it with the general population. She needed allies. She needed other intellectuals to assist and to engage and to go after it. She couldn't do it herself. So I think there was a point in time where she definitely was, maybe it's naive is the word, about how open certainly other intellectuals were to her ideas, and particularly to being able to overturn altruism. Overturning altruism has turned out to be, yes, I think unbelievably difficult. And I think Ayn Rand understood that at some point, but she did have to learn that. Hopper, do you ever feel like you're the only one who the only really active objectivist intellectual out there? Other objectivist thinkers seem to treat spreading these ideas as more of a hobby. No, I don't, because I know there's a division of labor among intellectuals. I do this, but you don't see, or you don't want to see, or you're ignoring what other intellectuals are doing. And the importance of training more intellectuals is far greater, I think, than the importance of just widely spreading the ideas. Because you have to, given limited resources, You have to focus on the future. And what you're really trying to do is create, 1,000 Alex Epsteins and Yarons and others who can then go out and get these ideas out there. And you're not going to do that if everybody does what I do. I mean, how are you actually going to study objectivism in depth? To study objectivism in depth, you have to, rolling my eyes, study. And studying with a teacher is dramatically more valuable, much more valuable, much more probable that something will come of it than studying by yourself. As good as studying by yourself is, it's just not as good. So right now, the balance within objectivism is that a significant number of people in objectivism are focused on teaching the future intellectuals rather than being public intellectuals themselves. And that has to be at this point in history. If Leonard and Harry and Peter Schwartz and others had not invested the time to educate me, I wouldn't be doing this. If they hadn't spent the time with Tara Smith and Greg Salmieri and everybody else, then they would not be as good as they are at doing what they do. So you have to go through, every intellectual movement goes through these phases. My hope is that at some point in the next decade or two, there will be dozens of people like me doing this and getting the word out there. But there's no other way, there's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts. Right? Michael, in some very crucial dimensions, are individual rights taken more seriously today? For instance, Japanese internment camps and racial segregation facilities would never be tolerated by the public or the court system. Yeah, there's no question. If you're black today, or if you're gay today, or if you're a woman today, your rights are more respected today than any point in human history. And maybe you can argue it's gone too far in the sense that other people's rights are not violated in order to accommodate you in some ways. That's true in certain circumstances, but overall, those kind of rights violations don't really exist anymore. And women couldn't own property 100 and plus 200 years ago, certainly, and in some cultures 100 years ago. Women couldn't vote, and some people, probably even here in the chat, regret that they ever got the vote. Blacks were slaves not that long ago, and Jim Crow laws existed in this country, in the land of the land of liberty and freedom, not that long ago at all. So yeah, I mean, it's there's no question that rights are much more. And if you look globally, there's more freedom in the world today than there was 50 years ago, than there was 100 years ago. I think there's less freedom in the world today than there was 10 years ago. I think we're heading in the wrong direction. But because certainly in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a real global push towards freedom, which has been reversed. As I predicted, there's somebody in the chat that thinks women shouldn't be allowed to vote. I mean, that's the level. Why are these people on my chat? It really is bewildering and mind-boggling that they are wasting their time here. All right. Chad says, did Bibi fund Hamas via Qatar? Why would he? No, Bibi didn't fund Hamas via Qatar. But there's no question that Bibi the Israeli government and all Israeli governments, not just Bibi, turned a blind eye to Qatar and others funding Hamas, to billions going into Hamas. And we know, and I think we knew back then exactly where they were going and what they were going to be used for. Bibi is, so to claim that Bibi funded Hamas is stupid. The Israeli government, way before Bibi, kind of encouraged the formation of Hamas in the 1980s as a counterbalance to the PLO, a massive, unbelievable, stupid evil strategic mistake by them, right? So, yeah, there you go. So I have to say it. Anybody who thinks they have good reasons for why women should vote is not welcome here. Is a barbarian, in my view, who has no respect for human reason, has no respect for the human mind, and is really a simpleton who belongs in a culture 300 years ago, and barbaric and stupid. So there you go. I said it. I lived up to Richard's expectations. But if you really, if you live in the 21st century and you think women shouldn't vote, then, Ayn Rand was a woman, right? And this is I'm trying to, this is objectivism, right? Who the hell, what are you doing here? Go spout your nonsense on some, Christian conservative, ridiculous website. All right. The Founding Fathers would really, the Founding Fathers brought into today, anybody with that mentality, really, it doesn't belong. Doesn't belong. And it's got nothing to do with, anyway, nothing to do with the importance of voting as a right or not. It has to do with your assessment of men and women, and it's despicable and disgusting. And the reality is, I am not going. The Founding Fathers was in 1776. You should go back to the 18th century. You actually belong in the 13th century. You should go back in the 17th century and relish in that. But it really is a. Remember, Objectivism is a philosophy developed by a woman who you would not allow to vote, probably not allow to own property, probably stick in the kitchen and commit her to there. So anyway, yeah. Let's see. Do you think it's worth an experiment? I can't pronounce your name. Sorry. Do you think it's worth an experiment if the government would give out all public land to private individuals free, or either a really low price and property rights from surface to core? Yes, I think not an experiment. I think it was done. It was basically done with the Homestead Act. I think that's exactly what should happen. 75% of all the land west of the Mississippi is owned by one form of government or another, and it should all be privatized. It should all be privatized tomorrow. I think the best way to do it is to auction at least some of it off, so that the government can use that money in order to repay the national debt. So that would be a good way to do it. Some views do not deserve arguments, and so let me just deal with this for a second while we're here. Some views do not deserve arguments. They do not. They do not. Not on my show, right? If I'm debating somebody, sure, but on my show, some views are so despicable, so ugly, so stupid, they don't deserve argument. That's one. Second, snarky remarks are not arguments, Richard. Snarky criticisms are not criticisms. You have never provided arguments. You provide some kind of elitist, snotty, looking down at oh, you stupid idiots who follow Yaron and think there's anything valuable here. You don't provide arguments. You never have. You are. You know, so you come here with your cynicism and your skepticism. You come here with your, superiority complex, thinking you're better than everybody else, and not making an argument, never making an argument, but just snickering at anything anybody ever says. You're the worst example of how kids have turned out because of our educational system. And that's exactly who you are and what you are. And you expect then to deal with arguments when you don't provide arguments, where you're just a snarky, despicable human being. And yes, horrible, horrible, horrible. And by the way, everybody on the Super Chat gets an argument. If you want to make an argument, the Super Chat's right here. Ask a question, make a comment, and I always provide responses and arguments. All right, done with that. Ocon discount code is only for in-person. Sorry, David. David just asked if it was also for virtual. The discount code is 24 YBS, Yaron Brook Show, YBS 10. 24 from the year 2024, YBS 10. Liam, being hated for loving freedom has been the strangest experience of my life. Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's partially this illustration of the fact that people don't know what freedom is, don't understand what freedom is, and as a consequence, but they at the end of the day, they really do hate freedom, even though they never admit it. Hopper Campbell, why are you waiting so long to do the Dave Harriman show? Are you waiting for a specific event? Stop asking me. I don't want to answer the question, so why you keep poking at it from all kinds of directions? What are you gaining from that? I'm not going to answer the question. I'm not going to tell you my opinion until I'm ready to tell you an opinion, and I'm not going to tell you why I'm not telling you an opinion, because that'll reveal, I mean, what's the point of all this? And I don't like talking about other people anyway. So who cares? I've said all I want to say about the topic. So please, no more Dave Harriman, or for that matter, evaluating other objectivist intellectuals. It's not what I'm here for. James, how do we inject objectivism in an age where reason is extinct? You have to have a rebirth of reason, and reason is not extinct. You can't develop AI without reason. You can't develop new cures for cancer without reason. You can't discover new, ideas in physics without reason. So, reason is being used on a day-to-day basis. You can't do most of what we do in life. You can't innovate. You can't create new products. You can't do any of these things without reason. So reason is not extinct. It needs to be used. Michael, was Donald Trump's father an honest and good businessman? I have no idea. I don't want to blame the father for his son's sins. I mean, I could guess, but it would just be a guess, and what would be the point? Bradley, have you ever heard of MAOA gene or warrior gene? Any thought on the idea of a neurodiversity, sociologically, not politically? No, I've never heard of the warrior gene or the NAOA gene. No, I don't really have any thoughts on neurodiversity. I mean, I don't have any, thoughts generally. I mean, this gene or that gene is a scientific question. These are science. I have, limited confidence in anybody's ability to tell me except for a few specific genes. This gene does that, this gene, particularly when it comes to human behavior. Suddenly we can associate particular genes with particular diseases, but to associate particular genes with particular human behavior is, it's going around this idea that I at least have of free will. All right. Yeah, David, good job on critiquing Kissin a couple of days ago. Wish he would at least reply, please do a show with Schiff and discuss gold, objectivism, current market situation, introduce objectivism to his audience. Yeah, I keep wanting to, let me put Peter Schiff on the list of people to interview. I think that would be fun. Yeah, we can certainly do that. It's better if he interviews me. That way, I get exposed to his audience, yep. All right, Ryan, support the show. Just a couple of bucks on a sticker means you value the show. Also, hit that like button. Like button over there doesn't cost you anything to do before you leave. Hit the like button. Thank you, Ryan. David, oh yeah, I already told you about the discount code. All right, David Carlson. All right, we cut off the question period now. We will move on to the final segment of the show, which is going to be about bailouts, which I think is, this is really super interesting. But it's kind of geeky for me because it's all about finance and banking and stuff like that. But I think super important and an illustration of an illustration of how problematic and bad the state of the world really is. I came across an excellent paper in the Journal of Law, Economics and Policy, written by one of my favorite economists, living economists, John Cochrane, and he has a co-author, Amit Seru. Amit Seru is at the Stanford Graduate Business School. It looks like, I don't know, maybe he's a graduate student because I don't see. Yeah, I don't know if he's a professor. I don't know. It's weird that it doesn't give his kind of credentials. But anyway, he is at Stanford Graduate Business School. Maybe he's a professor there. The article is called "Ending Bailouts at Last." It's excellent. It's in the, as I said, it's published, formally published in the Journal of Law and Economics and Policy. But you can get it in PDF form, so you can download it. It's not blocked and not hidden behind some paywall that is inaccessible. And I think you can even increase the font so you can actually read the thing. Oops, I increased it too much. Anyway, I want to go over the the story that the paper tells. John Cochrane is an interesting economist in that he a lot of his work is very mathematical, full of models, full of math. Super interesting, even when it's mathematical, but hard to follow because it's super hard. But he's also good at storytelling. He tells a good story. He's also good at writing papers that don't have any math and that just tell a good story. This is an example of the second. This is a paper with no math, no numbers, no equations, no calculus. None of that needed, and I encourage anybody interested in the history of banking, interested in bailouts, interested in what actually happens in bailouts, and interested in the solution, at least in the solution proposed by Cochrane, which I think, given where we are in the world today, I would take that solution like that. Not my ideal, not my preferred solution, not my ideal solution, but better than I think anything anybody else is proposing. Out there that's doable, even though his solution, unfortunately, even Cochrane's solution, is not very doable. So I want to take you through a history of bailouts, a history of the United States bailing companies out, bailing primarily banks out. Most of bailouts in history have been of banks. And really, before the 1980s, the United States government did not really bail out financial institutions, certainly not at scale. And I can't really think of any major bailout. There were a lot of financial crises. Hundreds of banks closed and shuttered. In some cases, before the establishment of the Fed, private bankers bailed out other banks in all kinds of structured deals in order to stabilize the market out of their own self-interest. And indeed, that was how finance existed for much of the 19th century, very early 20th century. And we can, this isn't the place maybe to talk about why all those banking crises happened during the 19th century. But it basically has to do with banking regulations and the dabbling of the U.S. government. Even back then, when it didn't have a Federal Reserve, the United States government could not stop itself from dabbling in monetary policy and basically determining the value of money and playing around with silver and gold and buying and selling and so on, and providing liquidity to the market, not providing liquidity to the market. Because of the Federal Reserve was established in 1914, and of course we had the great economic crash, the stock market crash in 1929. That, again, not the place or the time to go into, but because of government policies and Fed policies led to a massive depression, which kind of peaked in 1933 with hundreds of banks going bankrupt, people losing their savings. There was no deposit insurance in those days, and people did lose everything they owned in the banks. As a consequence of that, the federal government passed a series of regulations that established all kinds of regulations on banks, and they created saving and loans and regulations of saving and loans institutions. And those regulations basically are still, for the most part, they've been tinkered with, but for the most part have survived to this day. But the government didn't get into the business of, other than paying out when a bank failed deposit insurance to the accounts that were covered under deposit insurance, didn't get into the business of wholesale bailouts of financial institutions and other institutions until the early 1980s, until, surprisingly enough, the Reagan administration. Not only was Chrysler bailed out with a loan from the government, but much more importantly, and much more consequentially, I think, in the end, in 1984, the United States experienced the largest bank failure in its history. A bank called Continental Illinois failed. And basically, the reason it failed, and the reason hundreds of S&Ls failed in the 1980s and early 1990s, is because of, to some extent, what we're experiencing right now. But worse, because on the one hand, government was regulating at the time interest rates, not just interest rates that banks could lend and borrow from each other, but also interest rates that banks could lend to us and had to pay us for the deposits we put in there in our checking accounts. But also because of inflation. Inflation basically caused the banks to have to pay on their deposits more and more money. But the loans were fixed. Many of them had mortgages that were long dated. The federal government had granted the banking system deposit insurance, and in 1980, I think it was 1980, raised it to $100,000, which was an absurd amount. $100,000 was a lot of money. And they raised it to $100,000. And when you guarantee banks credit, which is what deposit is, when you put your money into a bank in a checking account, you're basically lending money to the bank. And so you're credited to the bank. And what the government is telling you when you give the money to the bank is, we will guarantee your downside. The bank will pay you interest, and indeed sometimes very high interest, but you'll never lose your money, because the government will always step in as long as you have below whatever threshold it is. We will guarantee your losses. This has been in place since the 1930s. Since the 1930s. Since the 1930s regulation of the banking system that FDR put in place. And of course, what that encourages banks to do is, hey, guys, give me a lot of money. And then the bank will turn around and make really, really risky bets with that money. Particularly as it's approaching bankruptcy. It's got nothing to lose. Shareholders are going to be wiped out anyway. Shareholders are going to go to zero anyway when they get to bankruptcy. But if they make really, really risky loans and some of them pay out, they might be able to escape from bankruptcy, save shareholders. And if they don't escape bankruptcy, if they go into bankruptcy because of the risky loans, shareholders are still wiped out. And the people who really suffer in the bankruptcy are the other creditors, the long-term creditors, the long-term bonds that maybe have been given to the bank when they raise capital. Depositors are whole because they get the money from the government. Shareholders lose everything, but they were going to lose everything anyway. So companies, as they approach bankruptcy, have an ever-increasing incentive to take on more and more risk with basically free money, money they pay a lot for, but money that has no downside risk. So in the Wall Street Journal in the 1980s, they used to publish this list of the banks offering the highest interest rates on insured deposits. And all those banks were banks that were about to go bankrupt. These generally were S&Ls, saving and loan banks, because as they approached bankruptcy, they started trying to suck up as much money from depositors as possible and make big risky bets with that money. Anyway, Continental Illinois failed in 1984. It was deemed at the time the first bank ever to be too big to fail. The bank had lost a huge amount of money on bad loans, particularly loans for things like oil exploration. And the FDIC seized the bank. The Fed came in. But they bailed out everybody. They didn't allow anybody except shareholders to take a loss. They bailed out not only the insured depositors, the people who were promised deposit insurance, which they had to do, but also uninsured deposits. People who had more than $100,000 in the bank were bailed out. And on top of that, bondholders who had no formal protection were bailed out. And really, this was the first big bailout really in American history, and it set the tone and the trend for the future in terms of bailouts. During the 1980s, hundreds of S&Ls, failed, but the government had to spend a lot of money to bail out the insured deposits. The S&Ls were not deemed, right? Were not deemed to, were not deemed to be too big to fail. So it was interesting what happened during this period of time. Well, during this period of time, early on, the S&Ls were allowed to stay open, even though they were technically bankrupt, under the idea that they might grow out of it. They might somehow become whole again. Of course, they'd only dug them deeper and caused the FDIC, the Deposit Insurance Fund, to take on even more debts. When that didn't work, regulators started shutting down banks even before they were formally bankrupt. Indeed, shareholders sued the government for that and actually won the lawsuit saying that their banks shouldn't have been shut down. There was no reason to shut them down. So during this period, the FDIC was paying out, but the banks were not bailed out whole. That is, you did not have a situation where these S&Ls were being, what do you call it, where uninsured depositors and where bondholders were being bailed out. Hundreds of banks failed. Insured depositors got their money. Cost taxpayers in the end $124 billion to settle up with all the S&Ls that were shut down during this period. Banks in the United States, I think the big banks in particular, looking at what happened to Continental Illinois, made a lot of big loans to Latin American countries that were offering very high interest rates. Interestingly enough, under this, even though they were very high risk, basically under the assumption that that the U.S. government would bail them out, an assumption that turned out to be true. The United States basically bailed out Mexico in the 1980s and early 1980s, bailed out Mexico. And it really wasn't a bailout of Mexico, if you really think about it. They provided a lot of money for Mexico so that Mexico could pay Citibank, basically repay the bonds. So basically the federal government bailed out Citibank in the 1980s by bailing out the Mexican government and by encouraging the IMF, funded to a large extent by the U.S., to bail out other Latin American countries. And that was a way of bailing out Wall Street. It was a way of bailing out the big banks indirectly. Again, every bailout like this, what does it do? It creates something called moral hazard. It basically tells the bank, you can take on as much risk as you want. The downside is capped. You can benefit all you want from the risk taking. You can take all the upside. You can get all the benefits from what you're doing. But when you fail, we'll bail you out. Well, that's exactly what happened. Banks became riskier and riskier and riskier. This happened in the 1980s with Latin America. It then happened in the 90s. And a lot of, banks and financial institutions got into trouble with the Asian financial crisis. In 1998, a big hedge fund, long-term capital management, took a huge loss on Russian government bonds, right? This is during the Russian financial crisis that followed the Asian financial crisis. And the New York Fed basically put together a consortium of firms and bailed them out. Right? All this really led up to 2008, the mother of all bailouts, if you will. In 2008, all that risky behavior that companies were engaging in for decades, under the assumption that they would be bailed out, that they would be protected, came to fruition. Banks would be doing a lot of stupid things. Now, I don't think banks doing stupid things is what caused the financial crisis. You can take my course on the causes of the financial crisis that's on YouTube and listen to that if you're interested in it. But the reality is that banks took on huge amount of financial risk. And the government basically bailed them all out. The Fed offered, the Fed basically completely, the U.S. government completely bailed out Bear Stearns, so that creditors wouldn't take any losses. The Fed then offered $12.9 billion in loans to facilitate the merger between Bear Stearns and J.P. Morgan Chase. This is in early 2008. And then it offered $28.82 billion to help purchase the assets of Bear Stearns. In September 2008, the Treasury Department offered almost $200 billion to Freddie and Fannie Mac to keep them solvent. And then, if you remember, the US government took temporary control of AIG, a large insurance company, deemed too big to fail. And the Fed offered a $141.8 billion fund in exchange for 92% of AIG ownership. The fact that Lehman Brothers failed a day before AIG was bailed out is one of the great mysteries of the financial crisis. Why was Lehman Brothers allowed to fail when everybody else was bailed out? You know, those who like Wall Street feuds would argue that it's because pretty much everybody who was making a decision about this was a former banker at Goldman Sachs, Lehman's hated rival, and had no interest in bailing out Lehman's. Maybe. But the reality is that Lehman Brothers, they couldn't cut a deal. They couldn't find a way to bail them out. They tried for a number of days, and when that failed, they basically let them go. Right? But then, when Lehman Brothers failed, and there was this fear that the banking system would collapse, the Treasury Department then raised, what was it, $700 billion to inject capital into large banks and buy so-called toxic assets. But they ended up injecting capital into all banks, whether they wanted it or not, whether they liked it or not. And at the same time, during this period in the post-Lehman Brothers era, they landed up giving loans to car companies, GM and Chrysler, that were in danger of bankruptcy. They bailed them out, but it turned out that the Fed had the discount window open to all kinds of companies, G Capital, lots of companies to prevent. So in other words, in 2008, bailout was the key word. Everybody who got into financial problems during 2008, big companies that were big companies, not small companies, and every little teeny itsy bitsy bank, all of them, were basically bailed out in one way or another. Now, almost all these bailouts were in the form of loans and capital infusions, and then all the money came back, and the government made money on pretty much all these deals. Doesn't change the fact that creditors who should have been wiped out, that's how markets work. You make a bad loan, they can't pay you back, you're wiped out, should have been wiped out, were not. Now, the response to this was Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank is an act that was passed in 2010. It's called the Financial Stability Oversight. And it established a Financial Stability Oversight Council and to oversee financial stability and to oversee too big to fail firms. It also created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which we talked about in the context of the Supreme Court decision about whether it got constitutional or not. Anyway, Dodd-Frank was supposed to, and this is how it was presented, it was supposed to be the bill that ends bailouts. It was the bill that would provide us with financial stability and end bailouts forever. And it was going to fix all the problems in the American financial system. Arguably, it did exactly the opposite. The bill was passed in 2010. Exactly 10 years later, in 2020, COVID hit. We all know the response to COVID, shutting down and all of that. But COVID was an opportunity for the government to basically go into we're bailing everybody out mode. And they bailed everybody out. This was the mother of all bailouts. Banks were bailed out. Small businesses, you remember PPP loans, were bailed out. Institutions, small businesses, big businesses, individuals were bailed out. We all got stimulus checks in the mail. Everybody got a check from the government. It was the largest bailout in human history. And nobody batted an eye. Nobody seemed to care. Like, Dodd-Frank was supposed to prevent this. Why were banks given a pandemic in such financial precarious position so as to go bust? Why did they need a bailout? You can make an argument about private individuals and small businesses. They needed a bailout because of the monstrous authoritarian dictates of the government preventing people from going to work or from going outside, just generally. But why, why did banks need a bailout when Dodd-Frank was supposed to have protected all that? So we got the mother of all bailouts. And again, nobody batted an eye. Nobody asked the question, well, wait a minute, why didn't Dodd-Frank work? And maybe nobody asked the question because the answer was, well, look, it was COVID, and it was this extraordinary situation, and it was just bizarre, and it was weird, and it's really unexplained, and it's all COVID. It's COVID's fault. But then, how do you explain Silicon Valley Bank? Silicon Valley Bank took a risk that is very easy to, if you will, anticipate. Not an obscure risk. It did not involve derivatives. It was not difficult to see. Basically, Silicon Valley Bank had a lot of uninsured funds, primarily from startups, and had bought with those funds during COVID and just after COVID. You remember, venture capital went through the roof after COVID. Venture capital funds had a lot of cash. They put it in the bank, a Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank suddenly had a lot of cash, and it decided to use that cash. This is a period of 0% interest rates, not to buy the 0% short-term government bonds, government treasuries, but to buy long-dated bonds, which makes sense because long-dated bonds were at least giving you 3-4% so that they could make a profit over that versus what they were paying depositors. And the risk there is, of course, that interest rates go up. When interest rates go up, now you've got a real problem because whatever loans you've made with this money or whatever loans, whatever bonds you bought will not reprice. It's fixed. Let's say you bought them and they were paying 3%, and now interest rates jump to 5%. You're basically losing 2% on the money. Now that's interest rate risk. That is banking 101. That is completely predictable. Why wasn't it hedged? Why wasn't it accounted for? Why was there such a mismatch between long-term assets and short-term liabilities? Why was this going on? Where were the regulators? Where was Dodd-Frank? This is exactly what Dodd-Frank was supposed to save us from. This is exactly the kind of risks that Dodd-Frank was supposed to be able to predict. Wouldn't happen. Instead, Silicon Valley went under because there was a bank run very similar to the ones in the 1930s. Very similar to the ones in the 1930s. And the government didn't know what to do. Silicon Valley Bank is not a too-big-to-fail bank. It's not a systemic bank. But the government was afraid of, quote, contagion. So they bailed them out. They didn't just bail out insured depositors, which is what deposit insurance does. They bailed out all the creditors to Silicon Valley Bank. The only people who lost any money were shareholders. The same thing happened a month later to First Republic. They bailed out everybody. Everybody was made whole. So what went wrong? Why did Dodd-Frank not work? I mean, I know why it didn't work, but why didn't it work? Is anybody thinking about this? Is anybody suggesting solutions? How to prevent bank runs in the future? How to prevent banks from taking on these kind of risks? And this is not just bad management. This is inherent in the nature of banking today. Banks have massive leverage. They have to keep very low reserves. They have very little capital. But that's by regulation. That's what they need to do. Banks are set up to fail. And the belief is, and they have moral hazard on top of that, to encourage them to take the risks that will bring about their failures. And the idea is, don't worry, system out there, don't worry, because we have established a regulatory system. We have empowered regulatory bodies to oversee what they do, to oversee their behavior, and make sure they behave themselves, and make sure they don't fail. But that doesn't work. I mean, I don't know why anybody ever thought it would work. Anybody who knows anything about regulation would know that it wouldn't work. But it hasn't worked again. And again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And yet nobody steps back and questions, okay, well, what do we do? How do we fix this? What they suggest is maybe more regulations. There's now Basel III, which is going to be a European and American big regulatory thing. By the way, the Swiss bailed out Credit Suisse. Everybody who was accredited at Credit Suisse was basically bailed out. So it's not just a US issue. And now they got Basel III, which is just create more moral hazard in a system rife with moral hazard, with huge amounts of moral hazard. And a system that is structured in a way as to induce failure. If you're leveraged 9-to-1, which is what most banks are leveraged, it doesn't take much for you to fail. It doesn't take much for you to fail. And the incentives of shareholders and the incentives of managers are to take on risk at that level of leverage. That's already risk, just a leverage, because because a lot of these banks are struggling anyway and might as well gamble. And if you lose, then at least the creditors, who are supposed to be the ones who really monitor you and prevent you from taking on crazy risks, they get bailed out. And we can go through why creditors control you in terms of not allowing you to take on crazy risk, if you want to. So we now have a situation where whatever regulatory system we have has completely failed. By their standards failed, not by my standards. My standards failed a long time ago. By their standards it has failed. And the response to this is not, let's rethink it. Let's change it a little bit. Let's tinker with it even. They're not doing anything. What they are doing is they're expanding its scope. Janet Yellen has just announced that the Treasury Department now says that non-bank mortgage services are systematically important. And we are going to expand what's systemically important on and on. We've already bailed out Silicon Valley Bank, so basically any mid-sized bank in the United States is systemically important, and we need to bail them out. Now, you can run this pyramid scheme if you want. You can run this scam, because what does bailing out mean? Bailing out means you take on, the government basically monetizes huge amounts of debt, which is what they did during COVID, and distributes the money. We suffered the consequence of that with inflation. Inflation is basically a consequence of the massive bailout of COVID. The fact that COVID, basically the Federal Reserve printed money in order to bail everybody out because they couldn't borrow it. There weren't enough people to lend money to the US government. So they had to monetize it. They had to actually print the money to bail us all out. What happens when we get another 2008 and the government wants another trillion or 10 trillion, probably more like $10 trillion to bail out JP Morgan or Citibank or Midwest banks and the auto industry and whoever else. The auto industry is heading into trouble. You know that because we're now establishing tariffs to protect them. What happens when the government needs $10 trillion to bail us out next time? Well, we know now that if they just print it, we have inflation. But who's going to lend them $10 trillion? The government is running massive deficits. It has massive debt that nobody at this point thinks they can really repay. Again, who's going to lend us the money? Nobody will. So the only alternative is to inflate. And this time, the inflation will be much worse because the bailout risks being much bigger. Imagine China invading Taiwan and the United States cutting off all trade relations with China and the supply chain collapsing and businesses spiraling out of control in the United States. Banks that have loans with those businesses losing those loans. Imagine the United States needing to ramp up military production because it is, guaranteed Taiwanese sovereignty and therefore wants to ramp up its navy. And even if it doesn't, China is now clearly a military threat and we need to ramp up military spending. And yet it has to bail out the economy because the economy is spiraling down because of the massive delinking that's happening all of a sudden. And again, the banking sector is suffering a huge blow. And of course, it's not just the United States. This is happening in Europe. It's happening to our Asian allies. Japan and South Korea are panicked and hysterical and also losing huge because they are all very integrated into the Chinese economy. How does the U.S. manage this bailout? Where does the money come from? What happens to interest rates if they try to issue debt? How high do they get? I mean, this is the kind of event, and this is the kind of, because we built up an economy that is not resilient, that relies on the government to survive, that relies on government bailouts to exist, then the government is going to be at some point constrained in its ability to bail it out. From the S&L crisis in continental Illinois to bailing out the entire system in 2008 to bailing out the entire world in 2020 to bailing out a few regional banks in 2023, where's the money going to come from for the next big bailout? I mean, I'm not talking about a few banks here and there. That the U.S. government can deal with, and we won't feel the pain. We won't feel it. It'll be there. Your life will be a little bit worse. Every time one of these bailouts happens, your quality of life goes down a little bit. Not so much goes down, but you will have a lower standard of living in the future. Economic growth suffers. Less innovation, less progress, less success in the future every time one of these bailouts happen. But at some point, bailouts are impossible. At some point, the U.S. government just can't bail them out. And that is not pretty because these institutions are built to be bailed out. They're not built to fail. They're not structurally, particularly banks, are not structurally, it is a domino effect that can cause massive amounts of damage. So the government won't let them fail. That we know. But it will be forced to print money in order to bail them out. And then you get hyperinflation. And you get a real collapse of the U.S. economy. It also happens probably globally. So I don't know what happens to the dollar relative to other countries. I know what happens here. And we lose whatever happens to the dollar. I mean, the fact that the U.S. government is carrying the kind of debt that it has gives it less flexibility to bail out the economy if and when it wants. And the BRICS are in worse shape than America. Always. Always have been, always will be. In much worse shape than America. Anything that happens in America is 10x with the BRICS. So, over the last 40 years, we basically built, really, since the founding of America, the way we established our banks, the way we regulated our banks, the way we constructed our banks, we have built a fragile system. There's a really good book by an economist from Columbia University by the name of Charles Calamares called Fragile by Design, where he talks about how the American banking system was built to be fragile. Not on purpose, but that's the outcome. And it's never changed. And indeed, he makes the argument, and I would second it and triple it or whatever, that it's only become more fragile by design. Every one of these pieces of regulations like Dodd-Frank makes it more fragile, makes it more likely to be crises, more likely to be crises, and the U.S. government can no longer afford to bail them out. So we're in deep trouble. Not that I need to tell you this, but we're in deep trouble. I don't know when it happens. I can't predict, what's going to cause it. But the reality is that this inflationary period we had from 21 to 23, or going into 24 now, is small fry as compared to the price we would have to pay if this happens to us again in 10 years. It seems like there's a once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe happens every 10 years these days. We have created an economy that's super fragile, that's super dependent on government, that's super dependent on money created out of thin air, an economy that is built on leverage, built on debt, and therefore an economy that in a debt crisis could really collapse. And the cost of bailing it out would be so expensive, so outrageous, they would kill the economy anyway. This is not sustainable. It is not doable. And nobody, literally, with the exception of John Cochrane talking about it, nobody seems to care. And John has some solutions which I think are, I'd say, pretty good. No, they're not pretty good. They're excellent. They're not as good as I think it should be, but given that we don't live in the kind of world that I would like us to live, they're as good as it could get. And he's speaking to nobody. Nobody is interested. This was published in a journal. He did have an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. You can find it. Preventing bailouts is simple, but it isn't easy. I highly recommended op-ed. It's really valuable. I'll put the, for those of you who have a Wall Street Journal subscription, I'll put the link in the chat to the op-ed. I'll also put the link in the chat to the PDF of the article for anybody really interested in reading the article. I think it's very good, very readable. This is not very difficult. And, this is a hugely important issue. And again, this will determine the fate of the U.S. and the consequence of its government, and yet there doesn't seem to be anybody who actually is looking and thinking and wanting to do anything about it. We're setting ourselves up for this massive economic collapse, massive economic catastrophe. And the people in charge are dreamwalking. They are pretending everything's fine. They're indeed expanding the state. They're growing the debt. And again, the debt, the more debt the U.S. government has, the less flexible it is in an emergency. And look, the banking system cannot sustain itself without a bailout. That's the reality today, the way it's set up, the way it's built, the way it's created. And a bailout will mean hyperinflation or massive increase in interest rates, which will collapse the economy. So no matter how you look, either you let the banks fail and the economy collapses, or you don't let the banks fail and the economy collapses because of high interest rates. And the fact that we have now a soft landing, the fact that we haven't had a recession post-COVID is not good news, because it only emboldens our politicians and the economists who advise them to think that they are all powerful, all able, and can manipulate the system in such ways that will always survive and everything is good. I mean, it's scary stuff, much scarier than woke, much scarier than even the demonstrations at the universities. Those will go away. That'll disappear. It's not going to have a lasting impact in the United States. This bailout mentality, the fragility of our banking system, the fragility of our entire economic system that we live in today, that's built on massive amounts of debt, this is our way of life ending. This is the kind of thing you would expect an opposition party to really be propose solutions and encourage change and encourage improvement and work towards all that. Instead, all it is I hate you, you hate me, and everybody agrees with the bailout mentality. Certainly, the Republican Party today is not interested in reforming the banking system. The Republican Party today is not interested in stabilizing. The Republican Party today is not interested in making the system work any better. And while you can make it work better, even without completely privatizing central banking and completely privatizing the banking system, you could make it much better. John Cochrane has solutions that with a Fed, you still make it better. You give us breathing room. You allow the economy to survive. The current system cannot survive. Right? Cannot survive. And the consequence is that we have two political parties with their heads stuck in the sand. Don't want to face the reality and not interested in it. Not interested in dealing with the issue. All right. That is what I have to say about bailouts. Happy to answer your questions. Questions asked on the Super Chat, not questions asked on the chat. So use the Super Chat. You know, you should be asking questions about this. This is like important stuff and big stuff and crucial to life. You know, you don't want to see another Great Depression. You don't want to see standard of living really collapse. You do not want to live through that. This is an issue that should be bothering you and should be intriguing you in terms of, you know, what's going on, what can be done, how do you solve it, and so on. All right. Let's see. Yeah, and you can, just a reminder, support the show with a Super Chat. You can support the show with a sticker. You don't have to ask a question if you don't want to ask a question, but you can show value for value support. We've got, you know, over 100 people watching right now. Like the show before you leave. Doesn't cost you anything, and it helps with the algorithm. It really helps get these shows more exposure and builds up an audience. And finally, for those of you listening who can't participate live and can't support us through the Super Chat, you can applaud if you're watching on, you can do an applaud thing, which is money, on YouTube. And if you're listening to a podcast or something like that, you can become a monthly contributor, monthly supporter of the show. I very, very much value that. It's how most of the show is funded, is through the monthly support that you provide on Patreon or on PayPal through yaronbrookshow.com/membership. So yaronbrookshow.com/membership. You can provide monthly support. So please consider that as you listen. But those of you who are live, if you have a question, please ask it. And if you don't have a question, please consider doing the chat. And again, have a question on anything, I'm happy to answer them, but not without you putting something at stake. Chad says, would you debate Kyle Kulinski? He's terrible. Yeah, sure, I debate Kyle. Somebody organize it. I will debate him. That's an easy one. He is terrible. He's an awful leftist. So, yeah, set it up. I don't think he'd agree to debate me, but happy to. Apollo, is the female sculpture episode definitely going ahead, and if so, when? Yes, it is definitely going ahead. Not this coming weekend, the weekend after that. So the weekend, so 2 weeks from this last weekend. Probably Saturday. Probably Saturday. Apollo Zeus, are you familiar with Il Disinganno, also known as the release from deception? Was crafted by Genoese artist Francesco Queirolo. No, not by name. Maybe if I saw it, I would recognize it, but not by. Let me just look at it. Oh yeah, I am. Okay, I see what it is. Yes, it's the one with the fishing net, and the fishing net is carved. It's considered the sculpture with the most details. It's carved from one piece of marble. You guys can look it up. The release from deception. It's carved from one piece of marble, and it's just a stunning piece of workmanship. This is all one piece of marble, and it's just unbelievable. It is the way you find it, right? The way you find it is in Naples. It's in Naples, in a church in Naples. It's kind of a church museum that just has sculptures in it, or mainly sculptures, and the sculptures are all magnificent, and they're all as if trying to outdo each other with the level of detail in marble. And so I have not been there in person. I've seen photos, but definitely one of my travel plans is to go to Naples to see it live, and to see it, and there's some other sculptures in the same museum church that are just as amazing as that one. So it is truly, I wouldn't say crafted. Why crafted? It's sculpture. It's sculpted by. So I don't know why crafted by. It's the release from deception by Francesco Queirolo, and it's he's Genoese, but it's in Naples. It's in Naples, in this beautiful church in Naples. Paul, $50. Thank you, Paul. What do you think are the best ways to fight the coming financial collapse? I mean, here's the problem with the coming financial collapse. I don't think you can actually fight it, financially. That is, I don't think you can invest. It's going to be very difficult to protect yourself against it. You could buy gold, but the reality is you don't know when it's going to happen. And between now and when it's going to happen, we could have a huge rally, and you could make a lot of money. And by sitting in gold, the predictions of mass collapse, have repeated themselves since I've been a teenager, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and 2000s. Now, every decade there's a new fear of collapse. And it's very hard to, now it does seem like every time it's worse, every time it's bigger, and every time we're kind of digging a hole in which we're going to fall into, but it's going to be deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. But when are we going to fall into it? Nobody knows. What the consequence exactly of falling in, nobody exactly knows. So it's very hard to plan financially for that. It could take 10 years, it could take 20 years. What do you do in the meantime? So in that sense, I don't know how you invest based on this knowledge. Generally, bank stocks are much riskier than they appear. You can see that in how volatile they've been. Finance companies generally very volatile, very risky. And I think you can expect in the future more volatility than you have in the past. You're going to have to bear more risk for holding assets in the future. How exactly that plays out, very difficult. And there's no way to prepare for the kind of crisis that really wipes out banking and business, or banks are saved, but the interest rates go through the roof. Again, gold, if you believe in crypto, then buy crypto. In terms of fighting it, I think the most important thing there is, without histrionics, without being hysterical about it, without doom and gloom and the end of the world is coming, which libertarians are very good at, without really, panicking people and being hysterical about it, we've got to raise awareness around this. And look, a lot of this is about government debt, which people maybe are starting to become aware of is a problem, because the government debt takes away the potential for any kind of flexibility. And then we've got to start talking about the fact that our financial system is so leveraged, so unstable, so risky, so volatile, and that it cannot be that a financial system needs to be bailed out every few years. By the way, Canada's banks are not bailed out every few years. So Canada does this better than we do. And it's an interesting question why. I mean, I think I know why, but it's somebody has to say, wait a minute, something is very, very corrupt here. Something is very, very wrong with the structure and the way banks are regulated, structured, created in the United States and in parts of Europe, that make them so susceptible to bank runs, to bank crises, to these problems. And so we need to start asking those questions, and we need to demand from our politicians answers. Right? We need to demand answers. And not allow them to brush it under the rug, and not allow politicians to just focus on, the number one worry of Americans today is immigration. Not debt, not low growth, not financial distress, not the banking system. No, none of that. It's immigration. Immigrants that are helping the economy, probably have a soft landing. Immigrants that are actually producing wealth. That's what worries them. We need to find ways to change the priorities of people. And if we change the priority of the people, then we'll change the priority of politicians. All right. Questions can be asked in Super Chat. WCZN, Bible bribe to ignore chat, please. I try. It seems like it's difficult for me, but I'm doing better than I used to. So 1 outburst a week, I think I'm allowed. until I start blocking them, because I am tempted. Today I was definitely tempted. And I probably will. I just need to get to the point where I'm convinced that that's the best thing for the show. And there are probably 3 to 5 people I would block and just get rid of them and finished. And that would be, I think, better for everybody. Does the broken window theory apply to YouTube chat box? I don't know how. Iconivore, I don't know how. How does it apply? Broken window fallacy. You're going to have to explain that to me. I have no idea what that means. By the way, Paul says he has them blocked. I encourage all of you to block. I would block Richard and Ken for sure, right? I mean, because they're mostly just disrupting, and mostly their purpose is to disrupt. So, I mean, they have no positive purpose. They're not here to pursue any values. They're here to pursue a disvalue, clearly. And then there are others that you can pick and choose whether you want to block Scott, and you know there were a few others. But you know, if I was on the chat, I would definitely block Ken and Richard. They don't add value to your lives. All right, Carnivore, if you want to tell me in the chat what you mean by this, I would be curious. But I don't see any obvious way in which the broken window fallacy works for the chat. Yeah, I mean, so I don't see Iconivore, so be it. All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks to all the super chatters. Really, really appreciate the super chat. Really appreciate the support. Don't forget to like the show before you leave. Appreciate that. And what else? If you don't support the show, go to Patreon right now. Don't forget. Just go to Patreon, put your Yaron Brook show in, and sign up for $1 a month, $10 a month, $25, all the way up to, I think you can do $1,000 on there a month. Please do that, and so that we can, so we can keep the show going. So thank you to all the supporters. Thank you to all the super chatters, and like the show. Bye, everybody.